Welcome to part 3, our chapter on psychological disorders. In this section, we're going to take a look at 5 anxiety disorders that occur with frequency within the population. The first off though, when we talk about anxiety disorders, what we're talking about are feelings of excessive apprehension or anxiety. Now, all of us, during the course of the week, at various periods of times, where we may have some apprehension or we may have anxiety, but these are characterized by a pattern of relatively persistent apprehension and anxiety to the point where it really becomes excessive and leads to interfering with our normal lifestyle. And we go back to talking about the characteristics of a disorder having to be deviant and distressing and dysfunctional. The dysfunctionality really comes in here because of the persistence of it, the constant feeling of dread and apprehension. The 5 disorders we're going to look at are, first off, generalized anxiety disorder. Then we're going to move into talking about panic disorders, phobias, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is one we probably hear a lot about in the media these days, and TV shows and everybody else talks about people being OCD. And then post-traumatic stress disorder, which probably more you run into if you watch the evening news and any reports on our young soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. This is a term you'll hear used a lot when we talk about our concerns about our returning vets. Generalized anxiety disorder is characterized by a pattern of what we generally refer to as pathological worry. And this pathological just meaning that it becomes obsessive. We can't get it out of our mind. We can't escape the feelings of worry or dread. Okay? We estimate that about 6.8 million Americans experience generalized anxiety disorder each year. Women are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience it, as well as it can occur in children. And it does have a tendency to run in families as well. About a 20% concordance rate in relationship to that. Okay. Its onset is usually in response to some type of life stressor. And once developed, it can become chronic very quickly. In the sense that, going back to when we're talking about learning in Chapter 7, we talked about kind of a principle of generalization, is that they can really generalize some particular stressor. It starts off usually triggering it, but then we generalize that fear to all sorts of different situations. And that's what we're looking at here, is that it becomes pervasive and you just kind of get this sense of dread. And as we'll see, what happens is that people, because you fear going out into the world, because you really can't put your finger on any one thing that causes stress. It seems like everything causes stress and anxiety. You start to shut down that world around you and retreat. And that's one of the major concerns here. Other causes, it can be drug-induced. Excessive use of benzodiazepines can cause this. Long-term alcohol use, as well as even tobacco smoking. One of the kind of the lesser-known side effects of it, but it produces hypertension. And really, for people who suffer from generalized anxiety disorder, who are always feeling apprehension and tension, the last thing they need to do is use a drug which is going to heighten that sensation, even make them more jittery, more nervous. Okay? Neurologically, we believe that the amygdala plays a part in this. We've talked about the amygdala producing aggression and rage. It also has linked to producing fear. And so the fear is very similar to that kind of that dread response that a person feels who suffers from generalized anxiety disorder. What are the symptoms then? One is a persistent, uncontrollable tenseness and apprehension. 2, there's always going to be some type of autonomic nervous system arousal in these situations, such as sweaty palms, heart palpitations, even ringing in the ears. and that, but just a variety of things. It can be shortness of breath, things like that. But they're often present. Inability to identify or avoid the cause of certain fears. And that's where we talk about that kind of that generalized anxiety. It starts off with a particular type of fear response to some particular event, but it becomes quickly generalized. And this is one of those that, just it becomes pervasive. For some reason in our brain, we generalize that almost to anything in our world can produce tension. Okay. The symptoms to identify this as a generalized anxiety disorder have to last for usually at least 6 months. And so, in other words, what we say is, it's not uncommon to people to feel apprehension and anxiety, and we may feel it for a month, 2 months, 3 months, maybe even 4 months sometimes when we're going through high periods of stress, this time in the economy when things aren't going as strong, a lot of people are out of work. There are a lot of people who are just apprehensive about whether they're going to have a job tomorrow. They see other people losing jobs and they're concerned about losing jobs. And so when we look at this, though, is we say it must persist for at least 6 months, and then that takes it out of any realm of it being kind of a normal behavior and throws it into psychopathological behavior. Okay. The treatment for it is we use what we call cognitive behavioral therapy. And in this type of therapy, what the therapist does is works with the patient, and together they work to understand how their various thoughts and feelings influence behavior. And our goal then is to change the negative thoughts, into positive thoughts, which are more unrealistic. And part of what we really explore is we look at how unrealistic their apprehension is, and we'll try to pick out some stressors. And then now once we've said it's become very generalized, we'll pick out a few, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 stressors that they can identify that they feel apprehensive about. And then we'll start to explore the realistic feelings about that. Why should you be apprehensive about these? And then what we try to do is change those negative thought patterns where it produces a lot of apprehension into more positive, realistic ones, more or less showing them that it doesn't. We can incorporate into this therapy what we call exposure therapy. And this is where the therapist will expose the client gradually to increasing levels of a particular stressor, permitting the client to use their skills that they have learned to reduce the stress. So what I initially do is start off in therapy, we'd identify some stressors. We would identify various levels of stressors. Maybe the stressors work. Well, what least stresses you about work to what most stresses you about work. And then in exposure therapy, I'll start off with those least stressing facts about work, and then I'll work, and as you take that on, you can see the irrationality of it. You replace it with realistic feelings of, hey, okay, I'm fine. I don't feel stressed now. Then we move to the next level, to the next level, to the next level. And that's one of the ways that we incorporate cognitive behavioral therapy into treating this. We also can use serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors as well. And generally during the course of therapy for people who have a very strong generalized anxiety disorder, generally will use SSRIs in combination with therapy. What we're hoping, though, to accomplish in therapy is to teach a person how to compensate on their own without the need to use drugs. Okay. The next major disorder is panic disorders. And we can see a panic disorder involves the repeated attacks of intense fear that something bad will occur when not expected. And it's just like something's going to happen. I don't know when or where or how, but you know it's going to happen. And people will go into these panic attacks. And what is it like to have a panic attack? Here are a couple of examples, and let me read through the. You can read through them, but let me read the bottom one. The more attacks I had, the more afraid I got. I was always living in fear. I didn't know when I might have another attack. I became so afraid that I didn't want to leave my house. Now that's where we're getting at here when we talk about panic attacks, and this can even occur in generalized anxiety disorder. That last statement, they become so afraid they don't even want to leave their house. Now that's where that real extreme dysfunctionality comes in on the part of this particular disorder. And panic attacks, though, we'll show you some of the characteristics, and they are extremely scary to go through. And when they don't know when they're going to have another attack, they just feel, yes, another one of these is going to happen. This is when they usually start to think that they're going crazy. It's very rare that we do not see somebody suffering from panic disorder not to show up in therapy. Okay. The causes for it basically are unknown. We don't know why people have panic attacks. It does run in families again, as most of these anxiety disorders. It's 2 times more prevalent in women. Symptoms usually occur before the age of 25. So if any of you are over the age of 25, this may be an experience in life you don't have to worry about. And once again, it may occur in children. Okay. Here's what a person who has panic attacks goes through. It begins very sudden, and for most attacks, you usually will peak within 10 to 20 minutes. Now, peak within 10 to 20 minutes. So if we're talking about something, peaking, it means that it's going to go on for probably, if it peaks at 10, it's probably going to go on for another 10, 5 to 10 minutes as well. And so, we're looking at these episodes maybe being anywhere from around 10 minutes to maybe 30 or 40 minutes long. Okay. Sometimes it can be mistaken as a heart attack, where they have just severe chest pain, and it's just you feel this tremendous amount of tension. Everything is tightening up in your chest, and it will mimic kind of like having severe chest pain. Dizziness comes with it. Fear of dying is that, oh my God, I'm going to die. You're feeling this chest pain. It feels like a heart attack, and you think you're going to die. The other thing is a shortness of breath that comes in. You can't get really good breaths in, so you feel like you may also feel like you're suffocating while you're having the chest pains, and that's where the fear of dying. Fear of losing control, that you're not in control of yourself. You can't control this. The sense of choking, feelings of detachment. Nausea comes in, sweating, chills, hot flashes, intense worry when the next attack will occur. Probably one of the best ways to express what a panic attack really feels like, for those who haven't had it, you could say it's like just having the pea waddle, so to speak, scared out of you. Where somebody sneaks up behind you and put their arms on your shoulders, and you jump, and all of a sudden you got that shortness of breath, and you feel your heart pounding through your chest and things like that. That's the way a panic attack feels, but probably 5-10 times more in severity. And they can be very scary, and these things can pop up at any time. You could be sitting in the middle of a play, a movie theater, just sitting on your couch, relaxing, talking with a group of people in a social situation, and they just come up. And that's what makes us start to think we're crazy, because they don't seem to be related to any particular stress or stimulus. So it's not like I was under stress, and was thinking about it, and then all of a sudden I lost control over that. They just happen. Okay? So, panic attacks then cannot be predicted, because there is no triggering device, and that's where people think they're losing it. They literally think they're going crazy, and thus, oftentimes we'll see them show up in therapy. Okay, treatment for panic attacks. We can come back with cognitive behavioral therapy, as we talked about earlier. We can use something that's called interoceptive therapy. And what this is that we kind of simulate the symptoms of a panic attack in a controlled environment to help reduce when they occur during an attack. And a couple of examples. We can put a person, one of their characteristics is they feel dizzy or disoriented. Well, we'll put them in a spinning chair and reduce that sense of dizziness and disorientation. Now, what we're hoping is, by doing this, is that a person will get accustomed to it and they won't fear it as much. And therefore, they can feel that they're not losing control, that they can control. It's been here, I've been dizzy, I've been disoriented before. Don't worry about it. I know that it'll go away. Intentional hyperventilation will get them to hyperventilate intensely and produce those feelings of lightheadedness, kind of a derealization of the world around them as you're kind of drifting when you're feeling that, that lightheadedness and blurred vision. And once again, get them accustomed to it. Been here, done that. Doesn't scare me, and therefore reduce the level of anxiety when it happens. Get them to run in place and elevate their heart rate, get the respiration going, get the perspiration going, and that. And once again, what we're hoping to do is reduce the intensity of these behaviors or these physiological or autonomic responses when they actually occur, or at least reduce the fear or dread that you're out of control when they occur, and you kind of learn that this is not going to hurt me. Oops. Additionally, we can use serotonin reuptake inhibitors, antidepressants such as Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil. We can also introduce anti-anxiety drugs, the benzodiazepines, or what a lot of people refer to as the bennies. We can bring in Valium, Xanax, Klonopin, and Ativan. Ativan is one that we hear. Ativan and Xanax are two that we hear a lot more about these days being prescribed. Valium was prescribed, was the first one that we really developed and used back in the 80s and 90s, and became so overprescribed. Anytime anybody went in, said they're feeling a little bit of hypertension, anxiety, the doctor writes you out a prescription for Valium. We had so many Americans on Valium back then that the FDA actually thought about taking it off the market. So have to be careful how what we do with these. So anyways, the next major disorder that we run into are phobias. And got this handsome looking little guy up here on the right hand side that for most of us may go, oh wow, that's kind of interesting, but you also probably have a little bit of feeling of apprehension. That's kind of like, oh, glad it's a picture and glad he's not here sitting on my desk looking at me like that. And if we have a really severe reaction to that, then you suffer from what we refer to as arachnophobia. And people who have arachnophobia won't even go into an area where they think there may be spiders. And you can imagine that, what's the probability of spiders being? You go into the woods, you go into an older building, anything else, there's the probability of that, and they won't even enter that. And you can see where it can become extremely dysfunctional. But anyways, our definition for phobias phobia is marked by a persistent and irrational fear of an object or situation that is excessive or unreasonable. It's probably natural for us as humans is to fear spiders because some of them are poisonous and some of them can cause us great harm. So, it's good to be apprehensive until you identify, is that a black widow or not a black widow, or, a wolf spider or something like that, is to identify that. But here a person will develop such an extreme fear that they won't even go into situations where there's the possibility of a spider. And you can see that a person is going to start to really eliminate places that they can go in somewhat an irrational way. In the first part, very few spiders can really hurt us. However, most of them are just, they're just there to eat other insects and probably beneficial. But, we come up with that notion, the only good spider is a dead spider. Okay. Between 8.7 and 18%, so roughly between 9 and 18% of Americans suffer from phobias, according to the World Health Organization. Now, it's a pretty broad spread, and It just depends on what study they're looking at. There's some studies have found a higher prevalence of it, some are studying low. We can choose a middle number in between, but as few as about 9%, as much as about 18%, nearly double that, will suffer from phobias. Okay. It's more common amongst women in all age groups. And interestingly enough, amongst men, even though it's not as common, it's the second most common illness among men over 25 in the sense of a mental disorder. Okay. Taking a look at the different types of phobias that we have, and we can see up here, fear of water is what we refer to as hydrophobia. But we can break the phobias down into social phobias, specific phobias, and then agoraphobias. And up here, when we talk about social phobias, it's kind of like social phobias really are like what we can call them social anxiety disorders. And it's where a person has an intense fear of being scrutinized by other people. And to borrow a statement, from the book, it's kind of like shyness taken to an extreme. Is that sometimes we're shy, and we're shy because we don't know anybody, and we're a little bit apprehensive of the individuals here. But here we just go to the extreme, is that we're concerned about being scrutinized by anybody, and we just become literally shrinking violets down to where we almost become non-existent, because in a social phobia is if we leave them go unchecked, we'll literally withdraw from almost all social interaction, and that's one of the major concerns. Just to take a look at a specific social phobia, we have paresis here, which is not being able to urinate in reduced levels of privacy. There are some people, have such a social phobia that if they go into a public bathroom, they can't urinate because they're just fearful about being around other people and having other people around when they're performing this personal behavior, and they can't. Well, how many times do you during the course of a week do you wind up using a public bathroom as opposed to a personal bathroom? And that, but they suffer for it. They're the ones who love at the malls now and airports and places like that, where we have the family bathroom where they can go in. It's a single, situation. They don't have to be with others. But in part, one, because of just the convenience of having a family bathroom available, where a parent can go in with their son or daughter and be there with them. Part of it is to help these people out as well. Specific phobias are fears of a single panic trigger. And there's somewhat the easier of this group of phobias to work with, in the sense that we have fear of spiders, fear of snakes, dogs, water, height, blood, strangers, things like that. But here we at least can identify what is the trigger, what causes it, and then we can work to try to, alleviate fear to that particular object or event. Agoraphobia, the third major type of phobia, is a generalized fear of leaving home or a small, familiar, kind of safe place. And agoraphobia comes from the word marketplace. But fearing wide open spaces, and so we have a tendency to withdraw in to a very close space. And as you can see, this can be a progression of a social phobia, is that where we get this excess of shyness and fear of going out into social situations, that people are looking at me or things like that, to the point where I won't leave the house. And maybe even in my house, I'll even find a smaller space, such as my bedroom, where I'm just by myself and I don't have to interact even with my family members because I am so shy. And you can see where this can get way out of hand and become dysfunctional very quickly. Other, excuse me. to take a look at the frequency of occurrence of phobias. First up here, I think this is an instrument. If you can pronounce it, great. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but it's the fear of the number 13. And what's really interesting is how, kind of pervasive this was, or at least it was strong enough, and people were so superstitious about the number 13 that in many buildings, particularly buildings that are probably, built back before about 1990, there is no 13th floor. They go from 12 to 14, but nobody wanted to live on the 13th floor thinking, superstitiously that was a bad number. It was an unlucky number, things like that. Buildings didn't want to risk putting a 13th floor in case they had a fire. Everybody would think it was jinxed. And so a lot of buildings go from 12 to 14. Now, they may actually have a 13th floor that they'll use as a mechanical room or something like that. But for the most part, usually, if you live on the 14th floor, you're really on the 13th, but we call it the 14th, and then you don't think about that, well, I'm on the 13th floor. Okay, real strange, but interesting how it became so pervasive in society. And now, in the new modern buildings that we're building today, many of them actually will have a 13th floor. I remember staying in an older hotel not too long ago, and the 13th floor was the pool room, workout room, and everything else. And rather than calling it the 13th floor, they called it the spa level. So, just interesting, how this notion about number 13 and fearing number 13 has entered into our world. Additionally, what we have here, a study done by Curtis, took a look at the percentage of people looking at their normal fear level, what percentage of people normally fear something like this, and the percentage of people who actually have an excessive fear of it. So being alone, we see about maybe 6-7% of the population say no, they don't like that. But we have a smaller percentage, over roughly, let's say 2.5-3%, who say they really, really fear it, and that causes a lot of stress or anxiety. Storms, make me feel uncomfortable, but hey, don't like all that lightning and thunder. But there are some, who are going to crawl under the bed or go into the closet and not come out until the storm is over. Water. Fear of water is one, moving up close to 10%, and we see that we start to move up a little bit around the 4% level here. Close spaces, what we refer to as claustrophobia, feeling closed in, approaching about 5% of the population having extreme fear. Flying, and that a lot of times we'll put it under the term acrophobia. There actually is a special term for fear of flying, but most of the time we'll just say that they have a fear of heights. And roughly about 3.5%. Blood is a newer one, particularly with the pervasiveness of AIDS, and they're concerned about other bloodborne viruses and things like that. We've seen this one really increase probably in the last 10 to 15 years, and the phobia as well is going up. Fear of heights, when you can see, is one of the more popular phobias that we have. Natural for people to fear heights. I walk you out to the edge of the Grand Canyon, which you actually can do. You can walk right up to the edge and look down. There should be some sense of fear or dread in you. And, as opposed to little kids who walk right off the edge if you're not holding their hand. But for a lot of people, that's a major, we see greater percentage of phobic reactions in this situation. And animals. These two down here really are the most common fears that we really run into in treating as height and animals. And more cases than not, usually when we're working with people, are related to that. And a lot of times we'll get people who've got to fly or things like that, or even the fear of heights can lead to a fear of driving over bridges. Imagine trying to drive it around Atlanta, particularly through Spaghetti Junction, when you got a fear of heights. A person sees Spaghetti Junction come up and they're going to get off the expressway and try to drive around it. They're not going to drive through it because of all the bridges and just their fear of heights. So they can become quite dysfunctional very quickly. Okay. just to take a look at some additional ones. Interesting enough, up here is one that we don't think about a lot, but there are some people who have a morbid fear of injection. It's not necessarily the needle. The needle becomes a trigger because, without the needle, you're not going to have the injection. But most of them just don't like the notion of a needle coming in and putting foreign objects into their body. So, sometimes when we work with people, is it the needle, or is it the notion that foreign fluids are coming into your body? And so you really got to find out what really is the fear here when we work with somebody like that. But it's not uncommon to find it in children and adolescents, even young adults. Generally weakens over time, or probably just because the realization is this is not going to hurt us. In fact, injections can help us by helping prevent diseases and things like that. So, anyways, we go from then these types of phobias. So, additional phobias, then we talked about agoraphobia. We have a phobia of open places. We have acrophobia, which is the fear of heights. We have claustrophobia, which is the phobia of closed spaces, and hemophobia, fear of blood. And then the last one down there is kind of a unique one, xenophobia, which is a phobia of strangers, just a general fear of strangers around us. And sometimes new people move into community and things like that. You hear this one being used a lot more now because of just as a product of the terrorism that we've had in the United States, is that when we're around unfamiliar people and they come into our environment, we don't know them. It's like, are they here to do good things, or are they here to do bad things? Treatment of phobias is basically we can use behavioral therapy, and we use a process that we call systematic desensitization, and that in itself is kind of a mouthful. But what systematic desensitization is, what we'll do is we'll relax people down. And prior to relaxing them, what we've done is created a scale of different, let's say if they have a fear of heights, we'll create a little inventory with them of what is the least fearful about heights to most fearful of heights. Then we get them into a kind of a profound state of relaxation. And then what we'll do is we'll have them think about that least fearful thing about heights. And as the tension comes up, we relax them down. And eventually what we're trying to do is replace the learned emotional feeling of fear with a learned emotional feeling of relaxation. And we'll literally work our way through this from the least fearful to the most fearful. And so it may be just standing on a little stool produces a mild amount of fear. So we get them, to deal with that. And eventually we get them up thinking about flying in an airplane possibly and trying to reduce that. But what we're doing is constantly is relaxing them down when the fear starts to rise up, get them relaxed to where they can handle that particular fear level, and then step it up to the next one and next one. And that's where systematically we desensitize them to their fear by working from low fear thoughts to high fear thoughts. Cognitive behavioral therapy, we can come in and use this as more cognitive. The difference between the behavioral therapy and the cognitive behavioral therapy is cognitive behavioral therapy, we explore much more the irrationality of the thoughts. And the behavioral therapy, I may not really deal with whether this is rational or irrational. We just know that right now it's not working for you. It's interfering with your life, and we'll go with that. And the cognitive behavioral will actually try to explore the irrationalness of that. EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to post-traumatic stress disorder, because it's used primarily for that, but it can be used for phobias as well. But it's getting supposedly when we get you to move your eyes, it produces stimulation in the brain to break you away from irrational thoughts and allow us to explore those. Once again, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and then hypnotherapy. I have hypnotherapy at the bottom of the list. There are a lot of people around town advertising to do hypnotherapy for various phobias and things like that. However, there's no licensing requirements or professional standards for hypnotherapists. And a lot of these people, they go down, they take a weekend course at the Peachtree Plaza with 500 other wannabes, and then they get a set of nice DVDs and a little book, and they're set out to be hypnotherapists. And the organization running the seminar will give them a nice little plaque to say they're members of the New England Association of Hypnotherapists, which doesn't mean diddle, but yet they'll put out there that they're certified to do it. If you're going to go after, pursue hypnotherapy, what you want to do is find somebody who's licensed by the state as either a licensed professional counselor or a licensed psychologist, to go through this, where they have some very specific academic, that they at least have a master's, if not a doctoral level of training. And you got to be real careful, because some of these you may just throw a lot of money away and not get anything out of it. And if they do it wrong, believe it or not, you can be harmed by it. Okay. Our next major disorder is obsessive compulsive disorder. And this is the one that we run into a lot. We refer to it as OCD. And it's the persistence of unwanted thoughts or obsessions and the urges to engage in senseless rituals or compulsions that alleviate the stress caused by the stressor. So OCD is really an intense battle with uncertainty. You feel uncertain, and you come up with these little ritualistic behaviors that may kind of help it go away. We refer sometimes to what we call the Pontius Pilate syndrome, where a person feels as this kind of becomes obsessed with feeling maybe guilty, or and so what they do when they start to feel this sense of guilt come in, they're not sure why they feel guilty. They just feel guilty, and they can't shake the thought out of their head. That's when an obsession is. It's kind of like the more I try not to think about it, the more I keep thinking about it, and to the point that eventually is that they become just totally is obsessive. They can't think of anything else. And then they find out, well, washing my hands, will kind of cleanse me of that. It kind of helps purify the soul, and kind of as a representation of going back to what Pontius Pilate supposedly did after he, convicted Christ to go to the cross. So anyways, this is, a kind of a ritualistic behavior that a person can go through. So let's take a look at some of the things. Generally, OCD behaviors can have an early onset in life prior to about age 30. It's the fourth most common mental health disorder that we have. About 1 in 50 Americans are considered to suffer from OCD, and it affects children as well as adults. Causes of it? Once again, we're still kind of looking for what are the causes, but abnormality in serotonin levels, we find that there is a shift there. So SSRIs, you can see, is already on the horizon as a treatment modality. It actually may be related to Tourette's syndrome, as 20% of OCD patients experience tics. And tics is some type of nervous behavior. It can be coughing, twitching. A lot of people with Tourette's syndrome, they'll kind of hunch, kind of raise their shoulders, hunch their shoulders while they talk to you, and then kind of a forward hunch generally into you, and they just do it. They're not even aware that they do it. What they may be aware at the end of the day is that they feel really physically drained, because each time you hunch your shoulders like that, it takes a lot, energy and time again. But we're talking, something like this that they may do every minute while they're communicating, or that, or they may, roll their neck out or lift their head up, kind of crane the neck back, their head back, and that. And a lot of times they're not, but to be engaged in communication with them, that the constant clearing of the throat, or a little cough, or these other behaviors can become probably more distressful for the people that are actually trying to engage in behavior with them or communication than it is for the Tourette's person. But we'll see OCD people develop some tics, and as we said, as much as 20% of OCDs will have some type of tic that'll go along with it. Looking at what happens here in the brain when we look at causes, this is a brain here that has an obsessive compulsive thought. This is generally a normal brain. And what we're looking at is a PET scan here, and what we're seeing what they call high orbital glucose metabolism. What the red areas are showing high metabolic rate. And this is what characteristic when we talk about an obsession becoming all-consuming. Here's the brain, the way it should normally look if we have a thought. In here, we've implanted an obsessive thought into an OCD patient, and look how it just dominates and takes over. And you can see this, obsession is just the power of it, and the inability to escape that thought, and how much energy a person actually burns while going through this. Okay, when we look at the OCD cycle, then what it starts off with is that we develop an obsession, okay, about something. It may be a sense of insecurity, okay, and that sense of insecurity then produces anxiety, and as anxiety builds up, we're looking to try to alleviate that. And so, therefore, we perform a compulsive or ritualistic behavior. And it may be that my obsession about security is at my house, or, and so the anxiety builds up. And so, as I'm getting ready to go to bed, I'm starting to worry about, oh gosh, that I locked the doors, that I latched the windows, and things like that. Builds up a lot of anxiety, and I run downstairs and I check to make sure all the doors are locked and, that the windows are latched. That behavior produces relief. No sooner than I get back upstairs again and I start wondering, did I check them all? Did I give that back door, knob a really good rattle to make sure that it's locked? Oh yeah, I did. And then, but all of a sudden, that thought starts to build and build and build and build again in my head. It becomes all dominating. The anxiety starts flaring up that maybe I didn't, and back downstairs and I check the locks, and back, that produces relief, and back. And I can cycle through this, and it may be 5-10 times I will go through this cycle before I can finally get to sleep. And but I try to lay back down in bed, and that the thought comes back, and eventually, I'll feel secure enough that it won't produce that sense of insecurity that I felt, and I'll be able to go off to sleep. But you can see that these things just come in and they just roll, and they'll roll for several cycles through. Now, over here on the T-shirt, we have just said that I think is just kind of cute, is that I have CDO. And what's that? Well, it's like OCD, but the letters are in alphabetical order, and like they should be. And a lot of OCD people will get these things where that everything's got to be ordered. They straighten it. Everything's got to be just in perfect order. Their pencils are organized by color, by size, things like that on their desk. Everything is that. And you kind of see this element of perfection in some people. The one thing is that we have to look at here is that we have obsessive compulsive disorder, and then we have obsessive compulsive personality disorder, and they're actually different. The OCD person, when the obsession comes up, it generally produces, well, it always produces anxiety, to which we perform a ritualistic behavior. A person who is just a neat freak, a perfectionist, the perfection produces this behavior where you got to straighten everything up, but it doesn't produce anxiety. And so in the OCD, we say that it produces what we call ego dystonic, is that we feel a sense of threat to ourself here with ego dystonic, but over here it's actually syntonic, in the sense that the perfectionist knows they're perfectionists. They spend a lot of time getting everything straightened up, but they're really not upset about it. The behavior isn't necessarily ritualistic to reduce anxiety. It's just that they like everything being in perfect order, and will spend tons of time. And that's when we call it a personality disorder, as opposed to an anxiety disorder. So it's one of the distinctions that we have to make as psychologists when we're working with people. We may get a perfectionist in, and we got to find out, is the perfectionist a ritualistic behavior to reduce anxiety, or is it this just a characteristic of an individual? Now, that obsessive compulsive personality disorder can be just as bad because it's almost impossible always to be perfect. Okay. Anyways, then let's look at the some common obsessions and thoughts. And you can kind of look through the chart here, and you can see obsessions are the repetitive thoughts concerned with dirt, sometimes terrible things happening, fire, death. Somebody has the fear of fire, may not be able to go to sleep at night until they've checked the oven a half a dozen times to make sure that it's turned off and the burners on the stoves are off. For some of these people, sometimes you come in and make sure they just insert a switch that they can turn the gas off and they don't have to worry about it, but they'll still have to get out of bed 2 or 3 times to go down and make sure that they turn the gas off. So it's just one of those things. Symmetry, order, exactness is another one that sometimes is, mixed up with the personality disorder. Compulsions. What do they do? What are the typical types of behaviors? Excessive hand washing, bathing, toothbrushing, grooming, repeating various rituals such as in and out of a door, up and down from a chair. They sit down, they got to get up. They sit down, they got to get up. Checking doors, locks, appliances, car brakes, homework, things like that. Is that, once is never enough, and 2, 3, 4 times is getting warm. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times. Now we're starting to get there. And so, kind of like my little thing up here. I'm not obsessive. I'm not obsessive. And, it's like, all of a sudden they become obsessed with not writing, I'm not obsessive. And just can't do anything once it becomes an obsession. Okay. Treatment for it. We're back to cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure response prevention, which is like exposure therapy that we talked about before. We use serotonin reuptake inhibitors as well as electroconvulsive shock therapy is interesting here for very severe cases. And that we will use basically electroshock therapy. And it produces deep cortical electrical stimulation. And when we do this, what it does is that if we really hit the brain with a strong jolt of electricity, what we can do is clear out memories. And in this sense, what you're hoping is that the memory for the obsessive compulsive behavior will be gone, that obsession will go away, and therefore then we won't have this ritualistic behavior. The prognosis for OCD patients is that most will improve, but generally will not be completely free of symptoms. And that so we can help them out, we can really minimize it, but every once in a while it's going to come back, or to a very slighter degree they'll still have that twinge of insecurity, fear of fire, or something like that, but they won't feel that they have to go through the constant ritualistic behavior to reduce that. Okay. And the last major disorder area that we have to talk about is post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is the one that we see oftentimes with our veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan today. Was a big element also in the Vietnam War, particularly because of some of the gruesome deaths that occurred due to the booby traps that were set by the Vietnamese. We had an element in World War II. Wasn't as bad in World War II because of when we came back from the war, because it was such a popular war. Most people were willing to talk about the various experiences, and thus were able to help people out. Kind of talking about them helps diffuse that anxiety or stress that one feels. Okay. Here are some examples of where post-traumatic stress can occur. It is noted that it can happen at any age group, and it can follow natural disasters such as floods or fires, or events such as assaults, domestic abuse, prison stays, even rape, terrorism, war. The terroristic acts that we had in New York City was a major concern. We brought tons of therapists in to work with the people in New York City who either lost loved ones, or they had actually seen the towers fall, or just seeing the repetitive images on TV of the towers falling. And some of us saw those images where we saw people jumping 80 stories out of a building, and that can produce a tremendous amount of stress. And for this, they left a lingering source of stress that we refer to as post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. When we looked at the vets, 19% of the vets coming back from Vietnam suffered from it. 2% of the Vietnam vets that suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder were in serious, very heavy combat. Today, we're estimating that somewhere in 1 in 6 Iraq and Afghanistan vets will have it as well. And a lot of it is produced by, these roadside bombs and things like that, and just a terror, or seeing just a good buddy that you've developed friendships with, get shot, and it just leaves us this lingering sense of dread and fear and apprehension. Symptoms of it is that the 3 types of symptoms that we see in post-traumatic stress disorder people is they continuously re-experience the fear, avoidance, and hyperarousal. And let's take a little bit for a better look at these. Re-experiencing is that they oftentimes will have flashbacks. They'll actually relive the trauma over and over again, including physical symptoms like racing heart or sweating. Years ago, when I first started teaching at Kennesaw, I had a young man show for a very early morning class. It was a 7 o'clock in the morning class, and he came in soaked as though you had thought he'd been out in a rainstorm. And pulled him aside as he was coming in, and he just kind of inquired, and he had a flashback while he was driving to school. And he had been a chopper pilot in Vietnam and literally had driven his Jeep all over the road everywhere. And it was like he was evading, fire as he was going over the treetops and that. But these are the types of flashbacks. A lot of them will just have bad dreams or nightmares. They can't sleep at night because they'll be re-experiencing more or less the frightening events that they occurred, or the fear that was built up in them. From there, we have the second major set, which we call avoidance symptoms. And this is staying away from places, events, or objects that remind us of those experiences. So, we start to avoid, once again, we start to shut ourselves down. We can start feeling emotionally numb. We try to pretend that we don't feel anything in that. So I try to deny my feelings, but unfortunately, that has to be almost more or less generalized to everything, and starts to interfere with relationships we're in and everything else. Feeling strong guilt, depression, or worry in certain situations can come about here. Losing interest in activities that were enjoyable in the past. You just don't want to do anything, withdrawing in. And then having trouble remembering the dangerous event. Is that all of a sudden we start to seemingly forget. Now that would seem good, but the problem is that the fear is still there. I just can't recall it. Now we're starting to get into, even more apprehension. Okay? The third set of hyperarousal that can come about is easily being startled and kind of always feeling tense and on the edge, having difficulty sleeping, or having angry outbursts. It is this last one that really becomes really concerning. Is that we hear about sometimes people with PTSD doing some really bad things. And we had a few years ago, the gentleman walked into the Penske truck rental business across the street from the college, and he shot 6 people. And, the presumption was, and everybody started to look at, could this be post-traumatic stress disorder? Was he involved in the military? And was he just angry at the world, and it had nothing to do with anybody that worked at Penske? He was just acting out this intense set of anger. And we've had this before at McDonald's restaurants, and, in the post office, they refer to the notion of going postal when a person does this. But it's just that reason the post office office is so associated with it. A lot of the vets, when they came back from Vietnam, there were no jobs. And the federal government, in an attempt to help them out, hired many of them into the post office. So we have probably a much higher percentage of Vietnam vets working in the Postal Service than we do anybody else. And those that have post-traumatic stress, it's just more likely it's going to happen there. But going postal is a representation of a bad outcome of somebody suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. How do we diagnose it? If you have 4 or more weeks of the following symptoms, according to the DSM-4, it constitutes post-traumatic stress. So first, it has to be 4 or more weeks. So when we go through a traumatic event, we know that people are going to go through a lot of apprehension and stress. And actually, any of these behaviors here, such as haunting memories, nightmares, social withdrawal, jumpy anxiety, sleep problems, they're common for a person to go through after a significant event. However, when it persists 4 or more weeks, that's when we start to say that it's post-trauma, it's far past trauma, and at this point, a person is not coping well, and where we need to perform an intervention. Okay. Some people are, what's our resilience to post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, only about 10% of women and 20% of men react to traumatic situations and develop post-traumatic stress. Most of us usually can deal with it, and we'll get it out of our system in a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. That's painful, it's hurtful, but we can discharge it. Women are actually better than men, and probably because they're more expressive of their emotions. Men, we have a tendency to try to keep it in and keep it welled up, and we don't do as good a job of letting it go. So thus, twice the amount of men as women will suffer from this. Holocaust survivors remarkably showed great resilience. I mean, think of the horrors that they went through, but yet only a very small percentage of Holocaust survivors suffer from PTSD. Now, they had a lot of people around them that console them and talk about what was going on, and we find that actually helps in reducing the probability, so it can be a kind of a preventative measure. And that's what we did in New York City when we brought in all the psychologists post 9/11. We held community groups at churches, YMCAs, and everything else, got people talking about it, sharing their feelings and talking about their fears and anxieties, trying to let them out, get them out in a realistic environment and deal with them realistically, rather than keeping them pent up where they could turn into obsessions and things like that. All major religions of the world suggest that surviving a traumatic event actually leads to personal growth. And so rather than post-traumatic stress, which sometimes we refer to is post-traumatic growth, is that you become stronger. It builds character and things like that. Religions of the world generally say that, hey, these are great moments. They're learning experiences to grow from, rather than looking at them from the negative side. Okay. Treatments for it is exposure therapy is one, is that we'll try to expose. I think in the military, they've done some really interesting things by using virtual reality. Is that on the screen back here, you can't see, but you can go out and YouTube this actually and see some really interesting videos on YouTube where we do this. But he's actually kind of looks like he's playing a video game, but what he could be doing is walking down the streets of Fallujah right now, and seeing bad guys and seeing bombs or seeing rockets coming down the street and things like that. And she can watch and she can see how he's responding. She can see in his mind where he's going on these various screens, make recordings of it to identify those things that produce stressors. So in one of these kind of video games that are made specifically for the soldiers, they may have helicopters, missile launches, these improvised explosive devices and things like that. And as he walks through, you can see where the tensions really build or not, and helps us, zero in. It's kind of a form of, exposure therapy, where you're going to expose them to it, but in a non-threatening environment. They can see these things. They can see that they're not going to cause them harm now, and thus reduce the amount of stress that they feel. And so stress inoculation therapy incorporated into this is where we try to inoculate them against their stressors. See the stressor, calm down. See the stressor, calm down. Kind of akin to systematic desensitization. Here's where the EMDR comes in, and there's this notion of rapid eye movement. What we'll do is before we begin therapy, and we're going to talk about a person, help kind of get these anxiety producing things out, a therapist would sit in front of the individual and stick his finger up in the air and move it back and forth, left to right, and ask the person to track it. And what's believed to occur here, and when we still got a lot more research to do on this, is that eye tracking, where we may do that for a minute or two in front of a person, is actually going to help free up thoughts. It's kind of like thoughts have been stored haphazardly, not well constructed, so they kind of sit around, but we have a hard time putting our finger on them or finding them. And supposedly this movement of the eye triggers the recall of these thoughts, and then we can get them out, and then we can deal with them. It's been found to be effective. However, recent research is starting to show that maybe the basis for the therapy isn't as sound as we thought. So it's kind of questionable, but you hear people talk about EMDR. We can also do it with tapping. We can just sit and systematically or rhythmically tap as well, and it seems to do it. And I was watching a video of a therapist working with somebody, and he was tapping constantly on the person's knee while she was going through it, as a way of using this EMDR, but not using the visual, but using a kind of a sensory kinetic type of thing to help trigger the recall of those negative events. And then cognitive behavioral therapy, which is used by the U.S. military and most of the hospitals and things like that. It is really the mainstay. And then serotonin reuptake inhibitors, once again. Explaining anxiety disorders and just how they come about is Freud suggested that they're, product of repressed memories. So we got these repressed memories stored way back. They're trying to seep out, and as they're seeping out, trying to come into reality, they produce anxiety just because they're bad, negative feelings. Learning theory perspective. Just looking at this guy gives me anxiety disorder. These steel workers are incredible, aren't they? They can be 50, 60, 100 stories up just walking out there on those beams. Not me. Anyways, learning theorists suggest that fear conditioning leads to anxiety. Is that it's faulty learning? Is that we've learned to learn fear rather than relaxation or calmness in certain situations. It becomes associated with one particular object, and then we generalize that stimuli, to everything. It's not like, you get bit by a little chihuahua, but then how do you become fearful of all dogs and develop a phobia to all dogs? Well, rather than remaining specific to that one particular dog, we start to fear all chihuahuas, and then we start to fear all dogs overall, that they can cause us harm. And that's what the way learning theorists look at it is, an excessive case of stimulus generalization. Okay. Another learning perspective is to look at it from observational learning, is that sometimes we don't actually have to experience it. Maybe just hearing a really bad story about how somebody got hurt. Maybe somebody fell from a height, fell off a bridge or something, and all of a sudden we start to develop it. Or you hear somebody, who got bit by a snake, or you're watching a movie and somebody gets bit by a snake, and now all of a sudden you've got a fear of snakes, although you never had a bad experience. This all comes about from what we refer to as observational learning, and sometimes it's just vicarious learning. And the person didn't go through any particular learning trial to do this. They just heard a story, observed somebody, and it was strong enough, and for some reason flipped a switch in their brain to now where they're fearful of it. Natural selection. Going back to Charles Darwin, is just the belief that in our brain there are these primitive fears, such as fear of snakes, spiders, or other animals that could have done us harm. And these fears are preserved in us over the years by our genes and are passed on in our genetic code from generation to generation. Twin studies suggest that our genes may be partly responsible for developing fears, and that twins are more likely to share similar phobias. So if one twin has a phobia, it's not uncommon to find it in the other, and therefore we have some support for the genetics. Biologically looking at it, we can look at certain parts of the brain. We can see here in generalized anxiety disorder, panic attacks, and even in OCD, we find certain circuits of the brain, like the anterior cingulata, actually light up. And maybe what we have here is some buildup of neurotransmitters. This is where, in some cases today, we're actually exploring using anti-seizure medication for people who suffer from some of these disorders, thinking that maybe there's an abnormal release of neurotransmitters that in this case affects us emotionally, as opposed to like an epilepsy, which affects us motor-wise. And so there's some experimentation with the use of anti-seizure medication, particularly in the more severe disorders like obsessive-compulsive and post-traumatic stress disorder. And that wraps up our lecture on anxiety disorders, and we will pick up with part 4, mood disorders, in our next set.